Good afternoon, and welcome to the City Club. Dan Malthrop gave me a 2-minute intro that he bet I could do in 30 seconds. But having said that, we are very welcome to have Adrian Benepe, Senior Vice President and Director of City Park Development at the Trust for Public Land, with us here in Cleveland today. This is his first visit, and I'm sure won't be his last. It won't surprise many of you to hear me say that parks are vital to cities. For more than 80% of Americans who live in urban areas, urban parks offer their closest connection to nature. According to the Trust for Public Land, there is only one park for every 3,000 people in the U.S. Of course, research shows more that parks promote public health and revitalize local economics. They can make cities more efficient and less vulnerable to the effects of climate change. They also provide opportunities to connect people to the great outdoors and to one another. And this is the case of downtown Cleveland's Perk Park, a bevy of food truck activity on every Wednesday afternoon during the summer. Parks have been a part of Mr. Benepe's lifeblood. He began his career in the summer of 1973 working for the Parks Department in New York City's Lower East Side, cleaning toilets, locker rooms, at the dry dock pool on East 10th Street, and then picking up garbage, including huge piles of beer cans. I bet you that was fun. A little bit different now. His career has spanned more than 3 decades. He has seen the transformation of many parks in the New York City's park system, including restoring the historic parks as Central and Battery Park. He's added over 730 acres of new parkland, including the Hudson River Park, Brooklyn Bridge Park, and the High Line. He also laid the groundwork for an additional 2,000 acres of parkland within the city. Truly remarkable. As Senior Vice President and Director for the Development for the Trust for Public Land, Mr. Benepe is one of the nation's experts on the nexus of public, private, and nonprofit sector in public space development and management. The Trust for Public Land was founded to create parks and protect land for people to enjoy, and is the only conservation organization focused on this goal. According to the Trust, nearly 10 million Americans live within a 10-minute walk of a park or natural area created within the Trust for Public Land's help, and millions more visit these sites every year. Born and raised in New York, Mr. Benepe served as the New York City Park Commissioner for 11 years under Mayor Michael Bloomberg prior to joining the Trust for Public Land. Previously, Mr. Benepe also held positions of the New York City Director of Art and Antiquities, Director of Natural Resources and Horticulture, Operations Coordinator, and Director of Public Information. He is also the former Vice President for Issues and Public Affairs at the Municipal Art Society and the Director of the Annual Fund and Major Gifts of the New York Botanical Garden. Ladies and gentlemen, members, friends of the City Club, it is my pleasure and distinct honor to introduce today's speaker, Mr. Adrian Benepe. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for that kind introduction. I feel that those of us who either run or ran park systems are kind of just like the brotherhood and sisterhood of wizards. So it's a very unique thing that we do. And interestingly, the Cleveland MetroParks system and New York City Park system are pretty similar in size. They're over 20,000 acres and giant systems, and I've had a chance to tour some of that here today. I want to thank you for welcoming me to your beautiful city. I don't know if there's an official nickname for the city of Cleveland, but I decided this morning it should be called the City of Bridges. I've never seen more bridges packed into a smaller space, and it's quite striking because there's so many different architectural and engineering styles. And I find that what happens is when you live in a certain place for long enough, you forget what makes it unique. So maybe this is obvious, but it's extraordinary to get around and see the city. I'd like to, you met Pam Carson, who runs our Ohio office, but there's a whole bunch of Trust for Public Land people here, including our Ohio Advisory Board. So if you'd please stand up, Ohio Advisory Board members and National Board members and staff, Trust for Public Land staff from the local area and around the country. So that's a terrific group. So I think we'll get started. We're going to talk about the role of parks in cities, and there's things happening all over the country that are really exciting and fun and cool. And of course, there's a lot of reasons to build parks. You can see the sort of original reason is beauty, sort of escape from the city. But we have found that they are very important for community and economic developments. Public-private partnerships is a really emerging trend in parks and park development and management. The connection between parks and public health, always anecdotal, is now becoming very well documented. But as we confront the crises of public health and obesity and diabetes, it's an article of faith for us in the park business that, yes, we provide the place where most people get exercise, but it's now being studied by public health professionals. And finally, the incredibly important role of parks in environmental sustainability. So I'm going to try to make the case today that parks, which used to be afterthoughts in most municipal thinking, are really sort of first-tier solutions to a lot of first-tier problems in cities. And you start to stack up those layers of value. Suddenly, $1 spent on a park is worth about $4 or $5. Parks obviously make strong communities. What you see there is a little collage of some of the stuff from around the country the Trust for Public Land has been involved with. But this idea about parks and strong economies, and they're on the screen. And the one thing I learned about PowerPoint presentations is don't read the screen. The audience generally can read. But you can see some important facts there. But those are some actual studies that talk about the economic value, both the direct and the indirect economic value of specific parks, specific park regions. And as you know, or you may know, the Trust for Public Land did an economic value study here of Cleveland MetroParks, which revealed an $855 million return on the investment. And we generally go a little bit conservative. But so parks do, in fact, do extraordinary things. Most studies show that for a good, well-maintained park, there's a 15% increment in property values right across the street, and it goes down from there. But we're now finding that you can, as you do things that involve what we call ecosystem services, and have parks play a role in, say, storing stormwater runoff, there's a huge value there. In Chattanooga, the Volkswagen plant decided to open their American manufacturing plant in Chattanooga, in large part because of the quality of life, and the quality of life as coming out from parks. And there was $1 billion investment in 2,700 direct jobs and $550 million in economic opportunity. And the Volkswagen officials said, we moved here because it has this great riverfront park system and great recreational trails. The concatenation of parks and public health is something that I think is well documented. The image that you see at the top left there is it's a little thing called a fitness zone. It's something that the Trust for Public Land is doing now around the country. It's basically doing an outdoor gym for free, and I'll talk to you about that a little bit more later. The bottom image is the chain of lakes in Minneapolis, and Minneapolis is an extraordinary park city. Neither New York nor Cleveland or anybody wants to admit that Minneapolis is actually the #1 park city in the country, according to Park Score. But they, back in the 19th century and early 20th century, they set aside extraordinary pieces of property to have a great park system. But the role of parks in having the environmental role they play, the trees do in absorbing pollution and absorbing stormwater runoff and mitigating the urban heat island effect, is only now beginning to be fully understood. And then, of course, the direct public health correlation. Now, nice parks in cities was not always a given. Most of us older northeastern cities have park systems that date back to the 19th century. And then a very sad thing happened to a lot of cities, including New York, in the 20th century, in the latter half of the 20th century, is that as cities went downhill, so did the parks. And I'd like to say, as parks went downhill, so did the cities. And the city of New York that I knew as a child and a teenager was on a downhill slide till it hit a real low point. Does anybody remember New York in the 1970s? Yeah, not a great place. But that's the city I grew up in, and those are the parks I grew up in. And the city almost officially went bankrupt, and it was in terrible state in those days. But there was always Central Park. Central Park itself was in a terrible state. It was so bad that this is what it looked like at the north end. And for those of you who remember that cycle of decay and rebirth, this was actually the north end of the park. It was called the Harlem Mere, and it was once a very beautiful place, but The boathouse had been turned into a nightclub, and the nightclub was burned down by the owner because he wasn't making money, and it sat burnt out and abandoned. Central Park was littered with burnt out abandoned buildings, covered with graffiti and browned out lawns, and there were 1,000 serious crimes a year in the park. And you sort of despaired. People were leaving cities. You despaired that it could ever get better, and I despaired. And I joined the Parks Department at precisely that moment. So you had to have really rosy-colored glasses. We'd look at these pictures of old Central Park and say, oh, if only we could go back in time and see the park being nice instead of the garbage dump that it is today. And then something really interesting happened. The citizens of New York said, enough is enough. We're not going to let Central Park go downhill. And at the same time, a new government came in. May he rest in peace, Edward Koch, one of the great mayors in the city's history. And he brought in a young, dynamic parks commissioner who said, we got to do things completely differently, who in turn appointed a woman named Betsy Barlow as the Central Park administrator. And Betsy Barlow said, you know, universities, hospitals, museums all have advisory boards of leading citizens who help those things. We should do the same for a park. And thus was born the Central Park Conservancy, and you can see the partnership between a nonprofit group and the city, and together they run Central Park. So that happened just soon after I started as a park ranger. And this was the sheep meadow near the Tavern on the Green in those days, and it was just a dust bowl and full of dirt and broken glass. And then the first thing the city did was the first thing they did was hire a group of park rangers to sort of go out and sort of try to bring people back into the parks and make it feel like there are rules and regulations again. And that's actually me in the middle as a park ranger, right out of college, helping someone find something. And then one of my first jobs was to stand on the sheep meadow after it was resodded and explain to people why they couldn't play softball or football there anymore, which, as you can imagine, was not an easy job in New York. But the birth of the Central Park Conservancy gave rise, just in New York City alone, to all of these other conservancies. And so now the Central Park Conservancy manages Central Park completely in a contract with the city, primarily using privately donated funds. And then there are a number of other conservancies, some very small, some very big, some in poor neighborhoods, some in wealthy neighborhoods. But altogether, they raise about $165 million a year in private funds to manage public parks, which allows the city to take its public funds and spread those out to the vast majority of parks that do not have the capacity for private fundraising. And so they included the renaissance of the park system sort of starts there. And one of the great success stories was Bryant Park, known as a needle park, a place where you went to buy drugs or get mugged. Right in the middle of Midtown, behind the public library, was this terrible, scary park, restored beautifully through a business improvement district. And then Union Square, which is another great old historic square in Lower Manhattan at 14th Street, which all the commercial spaces around it were dying. This formerly vibrant area was dead, and it was brought back to life. And that's the Union Square today. I call Union Square, so Times Square in New York is for tourists, and if you've been there, you know that. Union Square is the Times Square for New Yorkers. It's where all the New Yorkers go to shop and be seen and have this whole civic dialogue. It's a little bit kooky, and there's all kinds of crazy things happening in it, but it's really beautiful and really nice. And one of the main things it has going on, and it was a birthplace for the urban farmers markets back in 1976, which I'll give a shout out. Shamelessly, my father started the green markets in New York City in the summer of 1976 to sort of bring urban farmers markets back to New York. But it's that sort of great activity taking place in an urban place that with people coming together, and you have some commerce, and you have some playgrounds, and you have some things for kids and for seniors. You put it all together, and suddenly you have a really crowded public space. And and that public space became the magnet for development of the neighborhood, and now it's the epicenter for shopping all around it. So the idea of parks as magnets for economic and social and cultural development is a pretty important trend. It's not just New York. It's all across the country. This public-private partnership model has worked out in surprisingly good ways. This is Piedmont Park in Atlanta. Anybody from Atlanta or been there? So Piedmont Park is like the Central Park of Atlanta, also a great old landscape park. But this is what Piedmont Park looked like not so long ago. And take a good look at these pictures, the abandoned swimming pool and the overgrown pavilion with a kudzu vine and stuff like that, because in the very next picture you see what was transformed into. That's the before and after, with the swimming pool reopened and the park brought back to life again through a public-private partnership. And that model happened again in Chicago. This is the site of Millennium Park before Millennium Park. So you had a parking garage below grade, you had a train station, and a dead economic zone around it. It was like a dead sea for the economy. And then the mayor gets together, Mayor Daley gets together with the private sector and the public sector, and $500 million later, you have a very expensive park, a very small, very elaborate, very expensive park. But the $500 million investment is way amortized immediately and more and way beyond that by the investment in the local area. And 4,000 residential housing units were added to the area immediately surrounding this park, and the population of the East Loop increased by 71% in that time. And so there you have the park as sort of a catalyst for development in a city. It's not just in the blue states, the red states too. City of Dallas had this enormous sunken freeway running right through the Woodall Rogers Freeway ran right through the middle of Dallas, cutting off the arts district from a nearby residential district. And they did a $100 million project, a public-private partnership, including $40 million in public money to put a park on a deck over, I think it's a 8 or 10 lane freeway. So it's an enormous width they had to span, and also have a public-private partnership with a nonprofit group running this new Clyde Warren Park built over a freeway. So here, this is really fine print. I don't expect anyone to read it, except it shows the range of conservancies in cities across the country, raising anywhere from just $25,000 a year, which would be a lot for a small conservancy, to something like the Central Park Conservancy raising $35 to $40 million a year in private philanthropic donations to run Central Park. So where does the Trust for Public Land fit into all of this? It had nothing to do with any of those things that you saw, or maybe a few things here or there. But the Trust for Public Land is a relatively small organization where the Nature Conservancy is 10 times our size, just to put it all in perspective, in terms of staffing and budget. So we work in both rural areas, but also we have a big focus on cities, what we call our Parks for People work. And so you can see those two maps there. In the red is the urban areas of this country. 83% of Americans live in cities or nearby suburbs, and that percentage continues to grow. So the question is, why are we working in cities? Because that's where the people are, and that's in many cases where the need is. And so we don't have an office in every city or even every state. We're working quite aggressively in about a dozen cities, and not so aggressively in a few more. Cleveland happens to be one of our busier cities. New York, Chicago, San Francisco, Los Angeles, and then we have some places like Chattanooga where we're very busy, and then other cities where we'd like to work, but the conditions just aren't working out. I could bore you for 2 hours about why things do or do not work in cities. But one of the cities that we really have done a lot of work in is not a big city. It's Newark, New Jersey, but it's a very needy city, right across the river from New York City, but very poor. Their parks department does not have any capacity to design or build parks. So we've been actually designing and building parks in the city of Newark, transforming schoolyards into playgrounds. We've built the first Riverfront park in the history of Newark. We also work in small cities. Bozeman, Montana is a small city, but it's doubled in population in the last 10 years. So it is, in fact, a city, and we're building what we refer to as the Central Park of Bozeman, something called Story Mill. And with these small cities are growing very fast, often don't have the time to plan for public space. And that was the case in Los Angeles, which is not, in fact, a small city, but 81 cities in a giant county, with no real sort of cross-county planning or even city planning. So the city of Los Angeles, which everybody thinks of as sort of a sunny, wonderful place, is number 45 on Park Score in terms of how well it provides parks for its citizens. So we're doing a lot of work in Los Angeles. And in Seattle, which is a great park city, we worked on building something called the Olympic Sculpture Park, crossing over some railroad tracks and doing a park with modern sculpture in it. Our national trustee, Tom Reeve, was actually from the Seattle area, and this was one of our major projects there. So we work on a very small scale, sometimes a larger scale. but increasingly working in cities. And one of the ways we figure out where to work is through something called Park Score. And if you have some time and you want to noodle around, Park Score is a evaluator tool for evaluating how well cities provide parks for their citizens. And we look at 5 basic indicators, the most important of which is how many citizens live within a 10-minute walk of a park or playground or garden. And that access figure is the most important, but we also look at, amount of parkland as a percentage of the city. We look at how much the city is spending on the parks, how many playgrounds per 1,000 residents, and so on. So if you want to see, this is a Park Score map of Minneapolis. Minneapolis, according to our Park Score, is the best city for providing parks in the United States when you add up all of the factors. And it's all color-coded. So what you see here, everything in light green means that all those people live within a 10-minute walk of a park. Where you start to see a little orange, they're not living within a 10-minute walk of a park. And 10 is sort of then you're talking park desert. And we're not just looking in terms of is there a walk to a park, but what's the poverty level, and are there a lot of young people in this community? So when you add up, you can't get to a park, the neighborhood is poor, and there's a lot of children. That's giving us some clues about where we should be focusing our efforts and where, in fact, the city should be focusing its efforts. And so that's a good city. Here's a city that's not doing so well. And Fresno, California, when we were only doing 40 cities, was at the bottom. When we moved to 50 cities, it was at the bottom. And when we expanded to 60 cities, it's still at the bottom. And it's an example of a sprawl city where the city is sort of spread out through suburban sprawl and nobody thought about the parks. It's really hard to fix those problems. Not impossible, but really hard. So Fresno is the kind of city, and other cities where you look at this city and you say, we can address that problem, but it's not going to be fast and it's not going to be easy. And so this is sort of our fixation. If you looked at a public health map and I was a public health professional, we'd have it mapped in a different way, but it somehow might match up. Another interesting thing is this word resilience. You hear this word all the time. This is a picture, it's a great picture. It's a picture of Hurricane Sandy arriving at the Rockaway Beach in Queens. And that was a very brave police officer in that car because it looks like one of those end of the world movies, right, with a giant wave about to. In fact, Rockaway went underwater, and then the next morning, this is what it looked like. Those sort of structures you see there, that's the stanchions of the former boardwalk. And then you can see some bits of the boardwalk that have been turned sideways, and that's what's left that didn't get transported into Jamaica Bay on the other side of the peninsula. There were $19 billion of damage done in a few hours in the metropolitan area by Hurricane Sandy, and 50 people died. It was the worst hurricane in the history of New York City, and it was utterly predictable. The places that we knew would flooded, and now they're trying to figure out, okay, so what do we do about this? And that's another whole long story. But in fact, parks are part of that solution, because as you build your barriers against the sea, as you deal with your stormwater runoff, you don't have to worry about the sea here. You're very lucky. But you do have to worry about your EPA consent decree and continuing to clean up the water that flows into the Cuyahoga and into Lake Erie. So parks are a very essential part of sustainable design to help address those issues, and they should be designed sustainably. So this was a publication that the Parks Department in New York City worked on with the Design Trust for Public Space. In fact, Nettie Compton, who's my associate director here, was the landscape architect for the Parks Department, doing most of the work on it. So what do we mean by sustainable or resilient parks? One is, in many cities, there isn't virgin land to make parks, and that's certainly the case here in Cleveland. It was the case in New York on the west side. The west side had no parks at all, except for just along the river, and people were living there. Former manufacturing district was becoming a residential district. So you have to recycle landscapes in cities. That's a trend. So the High Line, the former elevated, who has seen the High Line here? That's remarkable. Wow. It's become the most visited park in America, the High Line. Not most visited in terms of the most visitors, but most visited per acre, because it's only 7 acres and it gets 5 million visitors a year. So after the freight train stopped rolling, when it stopped being a manufacturing and food production area in Lower Manhattan, this is what happened. Nature takes over. So you had this elevated thing, and they said, we got to tear this blight down. And other people said, wait a second, we live in a neighborhood that has no parks, and this is kind of like a park. What if we preserved it? And so the Highland was preserved and redone at enormous expense. The city alone put $150 million into it, and then there was $20 million in federal money, and then $80 million in developer money and private money. But the return on investment was immediate, already amortized in new tax collection costs because 40 new buildings have gone up around the High Line. And there will be somewhere between $2 and $4 billion in investment in those buildings. Chicago, a very similar project, something called the 606, also known as the Bloomingdale Trail, another abandoned freight rail line, which is being turned into the 606. Here you can see it coursing through the Buckthorn neighborhood, and it's a 3.5-mile east-west trail. And then what it will look like a year from now. It's being redesigned by Michael Van Valkenburg Associates, a great landscape architecture firm. So these abandoned trails here are being redone, so they'll have woodlands on it. You'll have a biking trail and a running trail. This re-envisioning of urban rail lines is happening across the country, and in many cases, Trust for Public Land is involved, as we are in New York, where we're sort of doing what we call the High Line on steroids, because it's like the High Line, but it's twice as long and 7 times the acreage. This is another abandoned rail line, former commuter rail line of the Long Island Railroad that runs north-south to the middle of Queens. It serves 322,000 people, or a little bit less than the population of Cleveland, live within a mile of this abandoned rail line, in an area that only has one major park and has very little parks otherwise. And it is an opportunity for a relatively small amount of money. And you'll think it's funny when I say $120 million. Relatively small compared to the $400 million or $500 million or $600 million it costs to build the big new waterfront parks. But remarkably, it has this sort of bucolic section where it goes through a park, and then up above it's being used as a garbage dump and a place for people to do drugs. But it has a great variety of topography. It goes through a glacial moraine ravine. It runs up on a structure through several neighborhoods on an earthen embankment. But it could be transformed into this, so from old trails into this. And so this is something, I show you this as both inspiration and also comparison to the remarkable things that have happened here in Cleveland. The other role that parks plays in water management, is there anybody who would like to hear an explanation of a combined sewer system? No, you know what they are. I mean, you have one here. Anyway, combined sewer systems are a problem in cities, and they're particularly a problem for the EPA. The birthplace of the Clean Water Act I'm speaking in right now. This morning I saw the fireboat that fought the fire in 1969 that led to the Clean Water Act. It's like going to Lourdes coming here. To see, oh, that's the river, and that's the fireboat. And so it's really quite extraordinary. Anyway, we can't keep dumping, every time it rains, we're dumping really nasty stuff into the rivers in us old cities, including New York and Philadelphia. So what we have to do is do a much better job of cleaning that up. And so that brings me to the whole world of green infrastructure. This is a lovely diagram done by a woman who works in our Washington Climate Smart Cities unit, which shows green infrastructure is like the center of a flower, and all of these values that can flow from green infrastructure, the environmental values in the upper left corner, the sort of community values, health, and social networks, and public investment in public land, real estate values, with green infrastructure sort of at the center of all of this. And what green infrastructure essentially means, and many of you know what it means, so forgive me if I repeat it, it means using natural ways of doing the stuff that human-created infrastructure normally does. So drainage pipes, drainage basins, settling tanks, sewage treatment plants, all very important, and you can't do without them. But you can take a lot of that stormwater, the rainwater which is falling on our lands, and process it into the soil more naturally and have it provide services. This is a map of schoolyards in New York City. There are 1,000 schools in New York City. And most of them have what they call a schoolyard, which essentially means a large asphalt yard that kids can fall on and skin their knees, or teachers can park on. So about 10 years ago, the Trust for Public Land started working in schoolyards to transform them into playgrounds, with a quid pro quo being, if we fix up your schoolyard into a playground, it has to be open to the public after school. That's a way of sort of revaluing underused land. And the most recent, so 300 playgrounds have been, the mayor of New York, Mayor Bloomberg, embraced that model, took over the Board of Education, because mayors sometimes get to do that, said, from now on, I'm running the schools, and we're going to turn them into full-time playgrounds when they're not being used by schools. The money ran out, so now we're getting green infrastructure money from the water department, we being the Trust for Public Land, to continue this schoolyard transformation project. So here's one of our community outreach people using this wonderful device called a sewer in a suitcase, developed by the Center for Urban Pedagogy in Gowanus, Brooklyn, to teach how combined sewer systems work. Why do we do this? Because we go to the schools, and here's a typical schoolyard. This is in the Gowanus neighborhood of Brooklyn. The real estate version name of this is Burham Hill, but the historic name is Gowanus for the Canal. So this is a typical schoolyard, an acre of impermeable asphalt during a rainstorm. And this is what it gets transformed into. So it's a beautiful playground, but it's also absorbing every drop of rain that falls in it, which, to quantify it, is 500,000 gallons of rain per year. And if you do 500,000 gallons times 1,000 schoolyards, suddenly you're talking scale, and that's something the EPA can get behind and the DEP can get behind. And instead of an asphalt field, you have a synthetic grass field, but it's got a whole sort of spongy layer of gravel underneath it that absorbs and percolates the water down into the soil with some overflow valves, and even a rain garden in the corner, which functions as a teaching garden for the school. Again, it's all capturing stormwater. So it's doing all these great things. And stormwater capture can happen on all kinds of scales. So just all of those leftover little triangles where streets meet at angles, which are normally paved, you can dig those up. And so here's a typical corner in Queens in New York, and you dig it up, you make what they call a stormwater capture green street or a bioswale green street. And then this was the first one. This is the Beta Green Street, and this one captured 30,000 gallons of water just in one storm event. I think it was during Hurricane Irene. And no place is too small to function to capture stormwater. This is the world's longest name for the world's smallest piece of real estate. It's a right-of-way street tree bioswale. Basically, it's a street tree planting pit, but on steroids. It's 20 feet long, 5 feet wide, 10 feet deep, and each one of these, and it's got a little, I think I have a picture of it. No, I'll go back. So as you can see, it's got some sort of scuppers coming in from the street. So the water flows in from the street. There's a cut in the curb, and it goes into these things. And this Department of Environmental Protection in New York City is building thousands of these. And Nettie was the director of green infrastructure for New York City, cooperating with them. So it's big scale, medium scale, and even tiny scale. So if you do thousands and thousands of these street tree bioswales, you can do those services. And even there are something like 8,000 miles of elevated highways going through cities, and the water coming off those highways is usually just dripping straight out of the downspouts into your neighborhood. But each one of those could be capturing the runoff and going into, this is a very creative pilot project being done in a park underneath an expressway in New York. It's called a HOLDS. It's made for just holding stormwater runoff and bioremediating the water, all the nasty stuff that's in water runoffs from highways, and treating it in the soil and in the plants and making it nice. Los Angeles has 800 miles of impermeable alleys running through it. These are the alleys that the car chases take place in the movies. And so we're working with the neighborhood to do a green alleys program, to green up the alleys, make them permeable, and make them green, and make them beautiful, and make them community assets instead of these really awful, dangerous places. The waterfronts of many of our cities, Cleveland being a perfect example, waterfronts in American history were used for one purpose: commerce, right? The movements of goods and services. And so all of the stuff for moving goods and services was put on the waterfront. And a lot of the stuff you didn't want in your neighborhood went on the waterfront. The garbage dumps, all the factories, and you could just dump your effluent right into the water. It was really convenient. So in fact, the waterfront was the last place anyone wanted to be. Now everybody wants to be on the waterfront, but the waterfront really had to transform. So this is the Brooklyn waterfront 20 years ago in a place called, that's now called Brooklyn Bridge Park. But this was this was sort of typical. The post-industrial wasteland that was the waterfront in New York and in many other cities. The Bronx River was an open sewer for decades, the only freshwater river in New York City. It's now being transformed. It's all cleaned up, water quality-wise, but they're transforming the whole edge of the river in the poorest congressional district in the country. $200 million is being invested to make greenways and parks all along the banks of the Bronx River. Even the Gowanus Canal, which is a EPA Superfund site, a terribly polluted canal in Brooklyn, there's a project that's about to happen to transform the street ends at the low points in the neighborhoods into stormwater collectors and to, yes, the Superfund will clean up all the gunk in the bottom of the canal, but these street end collectors will clean up the stormwater runoff that's sheet draining down the streets. The point is, every place, there are opportunities everywhere you look to green up your act and to clean up your act and to make a cleaner city. And the investment is amortized almost right away because it's usually a lot more expensive. My favorite, you can't really see the details, my favorite axonometric drawing ever. These are not geomorphic layers. So this is a drawing for the Sponge Park proposal by D-Land Studio in Gowanus. These are bureaucratic layers. So to do anything in a water body, anywhere in the United States, but particularly in New York, and I imagine also Cleveland too, you have to work with at least a dozen different agencies, the federal EPA, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, it's a Superfund site, the State Environmental Organization, the City Parks Department, Department of Transportation, the Fire Department, the Department of City Planning. That's before you get to the design reviews, and each one of them might have a dozen different sign-offs. So it's taken 5 years to do about to get this quarter-acre site ready to go. So the other thing we really have to do is, if we want to do innovative things in our cities, we've got to cut through the bureaucratic red tape. And I imagine it's the same difficult story here. And it's all for good reason. I mean, the EPA is not the enemy, but everyone's got rules, and you have to follow the rules, but somehow we have to make the rules work more smoothly. Green infrastructure can be a big park, as it is here in Atlanta, along the Atlanta Beltline, the old Fourth Ward. This could have been a giant underground holding tank, but instead it's a big, beautiful outdoor lake with paths around it, made to manage stormwater in this neighborhood in Atlanta. Again, Newark Riverfront Park, the Passaic River is another EPA Superfund site. This is where the Trust for Public Land thought, we like easy projects, so let's choose a brownfield on a Superfund site to build our park. So there's for the first time, the citizens of Newark can get down to the river, which was, again, always used for commerce in its history. And then Brooklyn Bridge Park, I get back to Brooklyn. Anybody here with Brooklyn roots? Parents from Brooklyn, you grew up in Brooklyn, your best friend grew up in Brooklyn? There was somebody who once said, 1/10 of American population had some Brooklyn roots, but I see that's not true. Anyway, so Brooklyn Bridge Park has been built over what used to be an old shipping area, a series of wharfs and piers, and I call it the ultimate recycled park because they recycled the site. So the shipping area, instead of becoming condos, became a park. They had to make some hills in it. This is Michael Van Valkenburg Associates, a great landscape architect. And so they were this crushed stone coming from a tunnel digging project, and they used the crushed stone to be the fill to create the hills. And there were old warehouses on the site, cold storage sites. They used the wood from the warehouses to make the benches, and they used stone from an old bridge that was coming down to make the staircases. So almost everything in the site is recycled, including the water. Every drop of water that falls is either put in underground storage tanks for irrigation or becomes part of a new artificial, very naturalistic wetland. And so there's a continuous loop of stormwater capture in this park. And there you can see the stairs looking out over the Manhattan skyline, and the stairs are made from stone, recycled from an old bridge. So, doing that stuff is really important. So, Cleveland. Cleveland is a city with a lot of opportunities. Here's your park score map for Cleveland. How are we doing for time?
You're almost there.
Oh, all right, so try to go through. This is the most important part. All right, so here's your park score map, and you can see there are some areas in red. And interestingly, we found that there are some intersections between the red areas, meaning that areas in high need of parks, that also match up with the Northeast Ohio Regional Sewer District's needs to do green infrastructure to capture stormwater runoff. So working through the project Clean Lake, we are looking for opportunities to both help clean up the stormwater runoff and create parks and open space amenities in needy communities. And the Buckeye Road Green Infrastructure Site, this is a perfect example of where our GIS analysis of looking at where the park needs are come together with where the sewer district says, we have to do something with stormwater capture. And again, you can capture stormwater in an industrial-looking thing like a big capture tank or above ground or below ground, or you can make it do double duty. So we are working with the community, doing community engagement, and looking at this area that has low access to parks, high poverty rates, and a lot of kids. And so a lot of these abandoned properties can now be turned into green spaces. This is a very early conceptual plan. We've done some some early community engagement, talking with the neighbors, the church groups, but this is a way to create a whole new amenity, capture stormwater along a major thoroughfare, a highly visible major thoroughfare, and this sort of major gateway community. Working with a group called HEAL, which is an acronym for Healthy Eating Active Living Committee. They've come to us and said, we want a healthier community. We want to eat better, we want to get more exercise. So we got a grant from the St. Luke's Foundation, and we're going to be installing 3 fitness zones in areas around the city. And interestingly, mostly those get done in parks, but none of these 3 is going to be in a park, because they're going to be in the Woodhull Homes Estates, they're going to be in the East End Neighborhood House, and in the Fairhill Partners. So we're putting them where people live and where it's needed, but it's not technically a park. We can do them in parks too, but the point is combining, again, looking at where the need is, and then what are the other needs, the public health needs, the stormwater capture needs. These are some of the sophisticated approaches we need to take. Now, the Trust for Public Land Ohio office has a long history here. We actually got our start with the Cuyahoga Valley National Recreation Area, which, as you know, is now a national park. So our office was created the same year in 1974. So we got involved with some very complex things, like the Richmond Coliseum property, where we both acquired the property and oversaw the demolition before we conveyed it to the National Park Service. More recently, we worked with an acquisition from the Musical Arts Association to get nearly 600 acres surrounding the Blossom Music Center. So this was an important partnership during lean federal times. And then we worked with the National Park Service again on the Boy Scouts Camp Montauk and at the Frazee House, where we're again do key acquisitions of public space. And then, of course, a really big and important project for us now is working to complete the towpath trail and bring it to the lake and bring it to the Cuyahoga. So it's a very complicated thing. On the bottom right hand, you can see where the towpath trail comes in from south of Akron, and this 110 miles really culminates or terminates up here at the north in Cleveland. And on the left, you can see what has been referred to as the Lake Link Trail, but now is the Cleveland Foundation Centennial Trail. And so it's some very key acquisitions of, it's not easy to get people across roadways, across railroad tracks, literally through buildings to get to the lake. And that red trail does all of these things. There's some little key acquisitions where we are going to bring this trail through this sunken, this is where it gets more almost to the north end. Is that the west side of the flats? How about here? Yes. So I've been here 12 hours. So I was there today looking at that. It's a little bit over, it doesn't look like that now, it's quite overgrown. But it's the former, an abandoned rail line, sunken below grade as it heads out toward the lake. And so that's a key acquisition. And it's not just about sort of environmental improvements and doing things that make the better environment. It's also about social equity. This path will pass right by the Metropolitan Housing Authority's Lakeview Terrace estate and by Riverview Tower, where you have thousands of seniors and families who do not have good and equitable access to parks. Suddenly, this will be their front yard to be able to get not just to the lake and to the beautiful parks that MetroPark is doing on the lakeshore, but MetroPark will be the owner and operator of all of this stuff. And if you've seen this extraordinary, I just saw the wildflower meadow lower down this path. It's really extraordinary stuff. You have a very sophisticated, this is another thing, you lose like sight of things. You have a very sophisticated, very high-end, very skillful parks department here. So Cleveland MetroParks is one of the best in the country, so appreciate it. They're really extraordinary. Because it's scary for us bureaucrats. I was a bureaucrat most of my life. It's scary to work with partners because it's easier to just do things yourself. But they have fully engaged in this, and so this will culminate in this beautiful new bridge, which will take you out across to a destination at Wendy Park, which will also give you access to Whiskey Island and Edgewater Beach. So you'll have a way to walk, to run, to bicycle, to inline skate, and get over to these parks, which are really much less accessible. And the great caretaker of this will be Cleveland MetroParks. And I come from New York, so I'd like to sell you a bridge. Not the Brooklyn Bridge, but there is a bridge that has to be made still, and there is a naming opportunity here. So if anybody would like to buy a bridge or put your name on a bridge, I was joking yesterday. I said, it's going to Wendy Park. Maybe Wendy's would like to adopt it. But Then you could have the, no, okay. But it's up for sale. So, working on the waterfront is nothing new. The Trust for Public Land has acquired over 3,000 acres of the Lake Erie shoreline. We're working to protect East Sandusky Bay. Most recently, we worked with Lake MetroParks to create public access along the Erie Bluffs Reservation, and Lake County Metro Park just opened. So working along the lake and imagining the possibilities, coming up with how do you get access where access is difficult, these are all really important. So we like the Nature Conservancy, you can look at us as sort of deal makers. I mean, we don't, unlike the Nature Conservancy, we don't own or manage anything. We come in, we make the deal, we help out, we get out, and we move on to the next one. And that's the important thing, because why are we doing this? We're a nonprofit, so we can't make any profit. We do this for them. It's when you're making a park or planting a tree, it's the old cliche. It's not for us, it's for the next generation. It's for the kids, and those kids who have a happy, healthy place to play outdoors. They'll be the doctors taking care of us, and they'll be the leaders of the city. So we're doing this for the future. Thank you very much.
He went a little long, but I think it was worth it. Hello again. I'm Dan Malthrop, Chief Executive here at the City Club, and today we're enjoying a special program featuring Adrian Benepe, Senior Vice President and Director of City Park Development for the Trust for Public Land. We'll return in a moment for the traditional City Club Q&A. We encourage you to get your questions ready now. Go. Okay. We also welcome all of you here and those joining us via our webcast, which is supported by the University of Akron. And we thank also our primary media partner, IdeaStream. That's 104.9 WCLV, 90.3 WCPN, and WVIZ PBS, IdeaStream. And we also thank the many radio stations across the country that carry our programs. Television broadcasts are made possible by Cleveland State University and PNC. Today's forum is the Stanley and Hope Edelstein Endowed Forum on the Environment, made possible by a generous gift from Stanley and Hope Edelstein. Stanley and Hope, we thank you very much for your support. Would you please stand to be recognized? You're beautiful people, both of you. We have many community partners for today's program, and we'd also like to thank those of you who purchased tables for today's program as well. There's information about all of that in your printed program. Too many to mention because we want to get to your questions. But I would also like to mention that we're pleased to welcome students from Horizon Science Academy. Thank you very much for joining us. Student participation is made possible by a generous gift from the Loeb Foundation. Now it's time for the City Club Q&A. We welcome questions from everyone, including guests. Holding our microphones today, our Director of Programming, Stephanie Jansky, and Marketing and Outreach Specialist, Kirsten Pianka. Our first question, please.
To Brooklyn, New York, your area, and Fort Greene Park just fell in love with it. What types of things do you do, I guess, to get the crowdsourcing, community engagement involved with the parks and the programs?
Fort Greene is an interesting park. It's one of the lesser-known creations of Frederick Law Olmsted and Calvert Vaux. It's in Brooklyn. It's a small park which is dominated by this extraordinary monument at the top of the hill. There is some interesting history in New York City, including Revolutionary War history, and all the battles that were fought in the Battle of Long Island, New York, we lost. The good guys lost. But there was a series of strategic retreats, and one of the big battles was in what they call the Battle of Long Island, which was then the name of Brooklyn. And many Americans were taken prisoner, and they held prisoner in the prison ships in Wallabout Bay, just outside of where Fort Greene is. And there was terrible conditions. 11,000 prisoners died on those ships. And if you look at the total population of New York City at the time was maybe a few 100,000. So a huge percentage of people died, and their bodies were just dumped overboard and they washed ashore, and the bones were collected of these dead people. And so there's a big monument on top of this hill done by McKim, Mead, and White, under which are big stone sarcophagi full of the bones of the martyrs. It's called the Prison Ship Martyrs Monument. It's quite somewhat macabre. But anyway, Fort Greene Park is a very interesting neighborhood. Like a lot of neighborhoods, gentrification has been taking place. It's long been taking place. But a very racially mixed, economically mixed neighborhood. I think the lesson there is crowdsourcing is one way of doing it, but I think the big lesson for how do parks get good and stay good is involving the citizens, which takes an act of courage on behalf of the bureaucrats, because it's easier just to control things yourself. Things can get out of control when you say to citizens, we want you to have a voice in what happens in your park. But what I have found is that it's much better to involve citizens and take that risk than the other way around. And whether it's a Friends of group or a neighborhood committee or a civic association, they transcend government. So administrations come and go, mayors come and go, city council members come and go, but neighbors tend to stay in one place. And whether it's people who can write a check or people who are simply going to keep an eye on the place and make sure that they let the Parks Department know when things aren't going right, or they'll help plant bulbs in the fall, they'll help rake leaves, they'll come up and do a spring green up. Fort Greene Park has a small conservancy. It's got a lot of neighbors that are involved. It's also, the other secret to successful parks, particularly small downtown parks, is being able to pack 10 pounds into a 5-pound bag. You have to have the dog run, you have to have a little place for sports, you have to have some culture, some arts, a farmer's market. You have all of that in Fort Greene Park. Fort Greene Park, like a lot of parks, used to be a very scary, dangerous place, full of graffiti and really run down and dangerous. But when you have all those activities, as you know, right, it's a double-edged sword, dogs in parks. But, because dogs can damage parks. But there's no more loyal user of park than a dog owner. Because they're, rain or shine, they're like the mail carriers. Neither rain or snow nor heat nor gloom of night keeps these messengers from the swift completion of their appointed rounds with their dogs. They come out morning, come out night, and if you engage all those different groups, including the dog owners, you set aside a quarter of the park for a dog run, they're going to be out there, and they're going to clean it up, and they're going to have the dog run, doggy Halloween with dogs in costumes. But they're going to bring life to the park at odd hours, and a cafe, there's a farmer's market. So it's a different kind of, it's sourcing crowds, and only part of it is through media.
I have a two-part question. The first part, your discussion was really fantastic. And I remember, maybe it was last year when we had a vote on the MetroParks system, and it did pass. But some of the information that you gave today, if the public knew about it more so than what was given during that vote, it would probably help. And number two, my wife and I are dog owners, and we do use the parks. But in your discussion, there was a I'm not sure there was anything about birds and animals, and I think there's a lot of people, even like the Nature Conservancy, that really goes after the nature part with the animals and birds. And do you have anything to say about that?
Okay, so for both questions, one is the idea of marketing the value of parks by marketing their values, what we call a stacked layer of values. It's like a layer cake of many different kinds of cake. That's relatively new, and it's our understanding of the environmental roles that parks play and the public health roles that parks play has been either not there or has been anecdotal. What you really need, and I think what you're getting to, is you need the hard data that says, here's the economic impact. Here's the cost savings by doing green stormwater infrastructure in parks. Here is the fact that 50%, and we did, some studies have been done. The RAND Corporation did a great study about use of neighborhood parks in Los Angeles and found that 50% of vigorous exercise takes place in a nearby park. And nearby, they meant half a mile or less away. 50% of vigorous exercise. You think about that. So instead of the gyms, instead of everything else you might do, you're going to your neighborhood park to get your exercise. And the rest, you don't have to say that vigorous exercise equals health. The doctors will tell you that. You just have to prove that people are getting out and using a park. So I think you're right. We in the parks business, it's always been an article of faith. Oh, parks are good, they're nice. But we have to do a better job of messaging and of the ecosystem services, the environmental values, the public health values, the economic values. Almost most important, the societal values, the equity values that people, particularly in cities, come together in parks. The immigrant communities use the parks as a place for the birthday parties, for the Sweet 16 parties, for the family picnics. It's where you go to get exercise. The park needs to be safe, needs to be decent. It also needs to be flexible enough that it can adapt to, in New York, we have a lot of Mexicans and Central Americans, and they play a different kind of volleyball. It's a 3-person volleyball, And so built a bunch of these 3-person volleyball courts, and they use a different ball. And so we accommodate ourselves to the new citizens. And so marketing all of those different things is important. On the issue of dogs and nature and birds, it's, I think, unavoidable that in certain circumstances, dogs off leash and natural habitats don't work well together. Particularly if you have certain kinds of nesting birds, a dog running through a nesting area is not a great idea. So I think what you need to do is try to find a balance. In New York City, my predecessor, Henry Stern, was a parks commissioner. There were these terrible wars between the dog owners and the dog haters, dog lovers, dog haters. It was the worst. There was a cover story in New York Magazine called The Dog Wars. And my boss, who said things that I would never say, he referred to certain people as dog terrorists or canine terrorists. But the point is, there's always room for a dog run someplace. And then his idea was to say in certain parks that had the room that were not too environmentally sensitive, in fact, in many parks, he had a policy of allowing people to have their dogs off leash from 9 p.m. to 9 a.m. And it wasn't just sort of dividing the clock in half. It was that people aren't in the parks after 9 p.m. or before 9 a.m. for the most part. And it's good to get people out with their dogs in the parks at those hours because they keep it safe through that use. So very tricky issue. It's not one size fits all. But to the extent you can accommodate dogs, that's a very loyal user group. And generally speaking, dog owners, I assume the two of you too, are nice people because you're taking care of a dog. I mean, you have to be nice to take care of a dog. So you want to accommodate nice people in your park. Not every park and not all areas. Dogs generally don't belong in children's playgrounds. They shouldn't be in the swimming pool. But you know, there's in many areas you can accommodate dogs. I'm sure you've never had a dog war.
I love dogs.
He loves dogs. See, I love dogs too. Other questions?
Yes, you showed that picture of the school playground that was
Yeah.
all asphalt and how you converted it into a park, which was very nice. But on the other side of the school, of course, in Cleveland, we have this severe water runoff problem. And on the other side of our schoolyards, they're taking soccer fields and football fields and converting them essentially into parking lots with the use of artificial turf, it appears to me. But is this an issue? And if so?
Very tricky issue. So in those playgrounds that we're doing, the stormwater capture playgrounds, we're taking asphalt yards and adding an artificial turf field, which functions as a big sponge. So it's there mainly to have a safe place to play for just, not really for formal sports, but just for running around. It's a lot better to fall on artificial turf than on asphalt. You won't get a concussion. You won't break an arm. And they're also doing this ecological system. The other issue of sports fields, full-time sports fields, and natural grass versus synthetic turf, from a purely, so there's 2 points of view on this. One is a sort of instinctive reaction is natural grass is so much better. It's natural, right? You know, plastic grass, yucky, terrible. But when you start to look at the environmental issues there, you won't find a lawn, a sports lawn in nature. You won't find this nice manicured lawn in nature because it takes incredible amounts of human intervention using chemicals, using polluting machines, using potable water to maintain that sports lawn. And so in effect, a sports lawn is a bit of an ecological desert, and the mowing machines are pumping a lot of carbon into the air. They're among the dirtier machines around. In theory, you can do an organic sports lawn, but in reality you can't, so you're using chemical fertilizers, which are going into the water system, pesticides, herbicides, fungicides, you're aerating and dethatching. And then if you're using it for football or soccer, half the year you're not going to use it because it has to rest because you do so much damage to it. So in fact, it turns out that on balance, a synthetic turf field might be better environmentally speaking. Now they get hot, so they don't help you with the urban heat island effect. They have to be thrown out every 10 years and redone, and you can't really recycle them very well. But they don't require watering, they don't require mowing, and if you have a hard-pressed budget, either the school system or park system, it's almost wrong to build a soccer field or football field made of natural grass now because half the time it'll be out of commission. They have these grass soccer fields in New York. I call them the grass museums. Every time it rains, they shut it down. They say you can't have cleated shoes and you can't play when it's wet and you have to wait for 24 hours after it's wet. You sort of say, well, the kids need someplace to play. So, but baseball, softball, other sort of low-impact sports, natural grass is great. So I think you need a balance. And if you you know, if you're playing cricket on it and you're only playing a couple times a week, natural grass is great. But if you want to play soccer and football all day long, synthetic turf is probably the answer, even though it gets hot and doesn't smell nice.
Today at the City Club, we have been enjoying a special program with Adrian Benepe, Senior Vice President and Director of City Park Development for the Trust for Public Land. Thank you, Mr. Benepe, and thank you, ladies and gentlemen. This forum is now adjourned. Excellent job.